Hello? This is Melissa Reed's Avatar, Chapter 9. After a full day of triage and surgery, of making calls that meant life or death with only an educated hope that his decisions would prove sound, Bashir was exhausted. But as his backlog of critical cases wound down, he found himself wishing for more to do. So many lost, so many that no one had got to in time, who could have been saved. Not only was it painful to review the incredible waste of life, having no pressing matter to attend to meant that there was nothing to keep him from what he thought of as the death watch. Those cases for which there was no reasonable hope. Sorry about that. There's a bumblebee flying around in here. Okay. So many lost, so many that no one had got to in time, who could have been saved. Not only was it painful to review the incredible waste of life, having no pressing matter to attend to meant that there was nothing to keep him from what he thought of as the death watch. Those cases for which there was no reasonable hope. Nothing I can do, nothing at all. For all I've researched and studied, for all my abilities, I may as well wish them better. Hello, Sam. There had been 6 in all. Now there were 3 in the infirmary's ICU, the room quiet and still, but for monitor sounds and the stifled tears of the visitors. A nurse moved lightly between the beds, assuring that there would be no more pain for the dying. Bashir stood in the doorway from surgery, looking at them, struggling to believe that he hadn't failed. He'd beaten death throughout the day, through proper diagnosis and delegation and surgery, cases he tried to keep in mind as he gazed out of the ICU ward. Mostly he thought about the operations, because he had been able to touch the problems, to physically heal them. A sternal fracture that had caused a mediastinal bleed in a Bajoran girl, only 11 years old, healed. A compound fracture that had nicked the femoral artery of a Bajoran security officer, who would have bled out if Julian's hands hadn't been fast enough. The flail chest on the visiting Stolibian boy, the open book skull fracture of the human ensign who had been on leave from the Aldebaran. They all would have died if his skills had been lesser. But that doesn't help these people, does it? It was faulty reasoning, of course, and logically he had no cause to feel guilt. But feelings weren't necessarily logical. He couldn't blame himself for the majority of the deaths that had occurred on the station, because most of them had been instantaneous. 46 plasma burn fatalities, a single rush of energy that probably hadn't even been experienced as pain. The rest of them had been lost to broken seals at the main lower core hull breach, except for 2 blunt trauma cases, victims of falling debris. There had been nothing that anyone could have done. Of the nearly 200 people injured, 20 or so had been critical, and only 11 of those had required immediate surgery or stasis. With the help of Dr. Tarses and the Bajoran surgeon, Jirani Semna, they'd gotten to everyone. 3 compartment syndrome cases had been treated and released. All 3 would be shipping out to the advanced medicine facilities at Starbase 235 for biosynthetic limbs. Except for some head traumas, a few incidentals, and those recovering from surgery, the immediate crisis was past. But for the 3 of you, 6, and now 3, a death watch because I don't know enough. In the cool antiseptic air, the 3 patients were silent, sleeping or comatose. Waros Keith, a Bajoran man who had worked in the admin offices, lay waiting for his brother to come from Bajor to say goodbye. Keith might have been saved if he had been treated sooner. A subdural hemorrhage, the resulting intracranial bleed too far along by the time he'd been brought in. The brain damage irreparable. The blow was from a desk clock, of all things, when the AG had shifted. Keith had been alone in his office and hadn't been found for almost 3 hours. Too late. 2 beds away, the sleeping Karen Adabwe was watched over by her betrothed and one of her closest friends. Karen, an engineer, had been both burned and frozen, caught in the major plasma leak, and exposed to an area of hull breach. It was a wonder that she was still alive, so much of her skin and muscle tissue had been affected. Her lover and a friend each held one of her poor, wretched hands, both crying, both certainly in more pain than Karen. She was beyond that, at least. Prin Tenmei, The new Starfleet pilot sat next to the last case. Munyardin? I think so. A lab tech. Bashir didn't know if they'd been dating or were just friends, but either way, it was over. Munyardin was a benzite and had been in mid-core when a cloud of chemical polymer gases had been released from a temp bank of atmospheric regulators. The alveoli of his lungs had liquefied. In a non-benzite, Bashir would have tried stasis and an eventual transplant. For Munyardin, for any benzite, there was no chance. With their cellular growth patterns, even external transplants rarely took. All that could be done was to make him comfortable and watch him die. It's not my fault. There's nothing that anyone could do. It was true, and it didn't matter. Not to the core of him. They were alive, but he couldn't keep them that way. Bashir turned away, knowing that there were others to see, rounds to make, people he could still help. Knowing that the names and faces of the Death Watch would stay with him, as clear and crisp in his memories as he'd just seen them, until the day he died. He was aware that people on the station were starting to debate the long-term consequences of the Jem'Hadar attack, but if they could see what he had seen, he could personally testify to the tragedy of the short term. It was more than enough. Then perhaps I should come back at another time. How long will she be here? Familiar. A familiar face. Friendly? Shar. That's Shar. It shouldn't be long, but I can't really say. The doctor wanted her to wake up on her own, a woman answered. He said she could leave then, assuming her responses are normal. The concussion wasn't severe, but we don't take chances with head injuries. I understand. Would it be all right if I left these with you? Ro opened her eyes, wanting very much to see Shar, understanding from the tone of the exchange that he was about to leave. She was in the infirmary, most of the beds around her full. The woman talking with Shar, one of the nurses. Ro wasn't sure what was going on, and the fact that Shar appeared to be holding a bouquet of bright green flowers only added to her disorientation. Shar, she rasped and coughed, her throat dry. Both Shar and the Bajoran nurse turned toward her, the nurse immediately moving to her side. Ro sat up a little, lightheaded but in no pain. What happened? Ro asked, and coughed again. The nurse miraculously produced a container of some mildly sweet beverage, and stood by while Ro drank gratefully. There was an attack on the station, and you were brought to the infirmary with a head injury, the nurse said kindly. But your readings suggest a full recovery. I'll go get the doctor. Shar stood next to the bed as the nurse went off to find someone. He held up the rather exotic-looking bouquet of waxy, tubular blooms with a slight smile. These are from Quark. I saw him on the way here, and he insisted that I deliver them. He said he was too busy ordering new inventory for the bar to stop in, although he might later. He says that flowers are a customary gift for the ill or diseased. These are Argelian, I think. Rose smiled in spite of her confusion, not sure if she was more amused by Quark's gesture or Shar's uncertain explanation. I'll be sure to thank him. Shar, what happened to the station? What happened to me? Before he could answer, Dr. Bashir appeared from another room, walking slowly and looking harried, his hair uncharacteristically rumpled. The smile he gave her seemed genuine, though. He glanced at the bed's diagnostic before moving to her other side, across from Shar. Lieutenant, Ensign, I have a few questions, if you don't mind. So do I, Rose said, propping herself up on her elbows. Chief among them, why is Quark sending me flowers? Bashir grinned, the expression as sincere as his smile, but she could see the strain behind it, could see that he was hiding some pain behind the sparkle. With how full the infirmary was, she guessed he'd had a rough day. Oh, I can imagine, he said. He opened a medical tricorder and passed the scanner over her head, his intense gaze shifting from the readout to each of her eyes as he spoke, his smile quickly fading. Tell me, what's the last thing you remember before waking up a few minutes ago? She frowned, thinking. There was a murder on the promenade. I remember meeting with you and Kira. And then I talked to Quark a little later about it. I remember that. She'd gotten an isolinear rod from him. She'd gone to her office, and afterward, she recalled feelings of unease, even distress, but she couldn't pinpoint the reason. Something about the holosuites? I don't know what else. I can't remember. The doctor nodded, setting the tricorder down. I saw you on the promenade not long before you were brought in. I'd say you've lost less than an hour of your memory. An amnesiac gap is perfectly normal with this type of concussion, nothing to worry about. Your cranial blood pressure is stable and your neurographic scan shows no disruptions. You can return to duty, but if you find yourself feeling nauseous or dizzy, or unwell in any way, you're to call for assistance and report back here immediately, all right? Ro nodded, a little surprised at his excellent bedside manner. She really hadn't interacted with him since coming to the station, and had assumed him to be generic Starfleet medical, patronizing and probably arrogant. How did I get hurt? You fell from the stairs in Quark's, Bashir said. Quark saw it happen and brought you here. It's lucky he did, too. With the way the station was bouncing around, you could have been seriously injured. She started to ask about the station, and the doctor hurried on, nodding towards Shar. But I'll let your friend fill you in on all of that. If you'll both excuse me, I have rounds to make. Ro thanked him and turned to Shar, who spent the next few minutes filling her in. She was amazed at all she had missed, and was appalled by the station's death toll, not to mention the loss of the Aldebaran. And Commander Jast. Hearing about her death hit Ro harder than she expected. A lot of Starfleet officers on board had a cold attitude toward Ro. Not surprising, really. She suspected most of them bitterly resented her presence on the station, and were probably dismayed that Starfleet Command hadn't made a move to arrest her for her past offenses. How the provisional government had persuaded the Federation not to exercise its rights under its extradition treaty with Bajor was a mystery. The end result, though, was that the Starfleet personnel on the station were forced to work alongside someone many of them believed belonged in prison, or worse. But Jast had been different. The commander had gone out of her way to be amicable. At first, Ro thought it was because Jast also seemed to be awkward at making friends. But just in the last few days, she had been starting to feel that the commander actually liked her. And with incoming communications basically inoperative, the only messages from the Federation have been relayed through Bajor, telling us to wait, Shar continued. Colonel Kira has all of the senior officers on standby for a briefing as soon as she gets word. What are we doing for defenses? Ro asked, finally sitting up. Physically, she felt perfectly fine, but their conversation was making her stomach knot. The IKS Chavoth got here just after the attack, and 6 Bajoran assault vessels arrived a few hours ago, so we aren't entirely defenseless, Shar said. But there's great tension on the station, and the fear that war is once again imminent. It doesn't help that the wormhole has opened 3 times since this morning, triggered by debris from the Aldebaran. He lowered his gaze, speaking softly. There's to be a service at 0700 tomorrow, in memory of all those lost. If you're not well enough to attend, it's going to be broadcast station-wide. Listening to his gently lilting voice, she could sense a change in him. He was tired, she could see that, but there was more, something deeper, more fundamental. Shar had probably liked Tiras just as much as Ro had, and had certainly known a majority of the station residents who had been killed. Though she wouldn't call him extroverted exactly, Ensign Chethane was one of those rare people who seemed to honestly enjoy listening to and learning about others. He had quickly found himself a place in DS9's community, well-liked, because, unlike herself, he never seemed to pass judgment. So different were their personalities, in fact, that Ro wondered more than once why he seemed to seek her out to her company. She'd finally decided that the old saying about opposites seeking out one another was probably true. Shar was quite young, and though obviously brilliant, relatively inexperienced, both in his career and in his life. His only assignment before DS9 had been on a survey vessel, primarily collecting information on the Vorta. He'd seen little or no battle, and although he didn't seem the type to shy from it, Andorians, as a rule, were combat ready. She doubted very much that he'd savored his first figurative taste of blood. Shar was too inherently decent, and she found herself mourning what he could not, the addition of a kind of tense wariness to his electric gray gaze, a look she knew too well from years of watching innocents return from their first real fight. I should return to ops, he said. The sensor arrays are operational, but Colonel Kira wants them at peak efficiency now that we're focused on the wormhole. Ro smiled at him. I'm glad you came to see me, Shar, she said, and was faintly surprised at how much she meant it. It was the closest thing she had to a friend on the station. Except for Quark, maybe, she thought, as Shar handed her the flowers. They had a pleasantly spicy scent. I hope that you will continue to mend properly, Shar said sincerely. And I hope we're not about to go to war. The unbidden thought frightened her, reminding her of all that was at stake, but it was a strangely compelling thought as well. She was only barely conscious that the prospect of battle had sparked her interest. They made tentative plans to meet later, and he departed, leaving her to consider all that had happened and to wonder what would happen next. So the station's residents were scared, but fear wasn't all that hard to inspire in a primarily civilian population. The soldier in Ro couldn't get behind the idea that the Dominion truly wanted another war, not with what Shar had told her about the nature of the attack. And for all of Kira's faults, Ro didn't think the colonel was dense enough to think so either, not when it came to matters of conflict. Though what Starfleet was convinced of was another thing entirely. Forget it, Laren. None of your business. She had her own duties to worry about, reports to make and listen to, security measures to be reviewed and evaluated. And pointless as it suddenly seemed in the face of the larger tragedy, there was still that investigation into the Prylar's death. Rose stood up, Quark's flowers in hand, and thought she'd already decided it wasn't her concern. She suddenly found herself wishing very much to know what Kira was thinking about, what she would say when she finally spoke to Starfleet, and what Starfleet would have to say to her. That's not the end of the chapter, but this video is getting fairly long, so we'll stop there and pick the rest of the chapter up on the next video. So, this is kind of a aftermath breather. I don't want to say filler, because filler implies it's not important or it's unnecessary, but more of breather chapter. Not a lot of plot, just describing the aftermath of the attack, deaths, injuries. It makes sense to put this in the infirmary. Bashir is not one of my favorite characters. I don't dislike him, but he's just kind of there. But this showed him to good advantage. He's very compassionate, very dedicated to his work as a doctor, and this shows that. Very kind to his patients, including Ro, who never expects anyone to be kind to her. Ro and Shar, I think we've established earlier in the book that they are friends. It's been so long, but showing how the crew is integrated together. As well as showing the aftermath of the attack. Really, that's not a whole lot to say about this. It's well written. It's just, we'll see what Starfleet's response is, how Kira handles her relationship with Starfleet, since she's in command and she's not in Starfleet. There's probably a good deal of tension there. So we'll see next time.